Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for this interactive pop-up session exploring Black women's history through Smithsonian Museum objects. My name's Allison Leitner, and I'm an instructional designer with the Smithsonian. And today I'm joined by my education colleagues from 6 Smithsonian museums and the Smithsonian Learning Lab. Today, they're going to introduce you to a collection of objects that can be used to teach about African American women across history and how you can access them online. We'll also be sharing 3 Smithsonian self-created, self-paced courses that you can enroll in online for free to further explore teaching with museum objects. Before we get into our session today, I wanted to explain a couple of logistics. A recorded version of this session will be made available as soon as it ends. You can find it on the same page that you're watching now. So this means if you have to leave early or if you want to watch something again or share the session with a colleague, you can. The session is interactive, and we very much want to hear from you. Please share your ideas and questions with us at any time using YouTube's chat or Facebook's comment box. So as we start off today, we had a warm-up question that we asked you to, or we're going to share with you. So just to warm up, we wanted to get a sense from you. So why is it important to tell stories of African American women in history? So I'm going to pause for a minute and let you answer in the chat using that YouTube chat or Facebook's comment box. So you can feel free to type your answer in there. All right, and then as you're typing your answers in, one of the things, we always use these warm-up questions to help build our community, but we also want to get to know a little bit about who our community is. So we have a couple of polls that we hope you'll join us in. We're going to use some Mentimeter polls that will come up in just a second. And as a community, we want to find out a little bit about who we are. So the first thing we'd like to know is, where are you joining us from today? And the way that you can engage with this Mentimeter poll, if you're not familiar with it, is you can go up to the top, which is www.menti.com, and then you use that code that's there, 6476-6595. And there's also a link in the chat. So I'm going to give you again a minute to join in and then share. And while you're joining that Mentimeter, I'll share some of the great answers I have to that warm-up question. So one of our participants says their stories have not been told. Another is to build empathy and understanding of the full American experience. Let's see. Then we also have not only to create a narrative for all modern contexts, but also to teach an underrepresented group. There's some great thought starters and that we're definitely going to build on during the webinar today. All right, so we have a couple answers coming in. We have a couple people joining us from Washington, D.C., someone from New York, someone from Canada, Tennessee, Maryland, Miami, Boston, very excited Boston. We're equally excited to have you with us. Montana, Danville, Virginia. So this is great. It's so wonderful to see teachers from all over the country joining us for these webinars. We appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedules to join us. So please keep filling in your answers there. And then we have another question just to help us learn a little bit more about you. We'd love to know what subjects you teach. So again, you should be able to advance on your screen now and let us know what subject or subjects that you teach. You can click more than one. There you go. Give a second for that to populate. So an art or art history teacher, museum educators, a couple museum educators, social studies, general education. If you're typing other, we'd love for you to follow that up in the YouTube or Facebook chat box and let us know what you do, what you teach. It's always helpful for us we love knowing who our audience is so we can really customize the work that we do to support you. Media, technology, science, general ed. It's wonderful. All right, and then again, if you're still working on that, please continue. I'm going to open up the next slide and let us know what grades you teach. college. Great, couple college professors here. High school, middle school. Okay. Great. It's super helpful. Thank you for taking the time to let us know who's part of our community in today's pop-up. We appreciate it. Someone works with a conservancy on environmental literacy. That's wonderful. Thank you for joining us today. Teach architecture. Excellent. All right, let's go back to our Learning Lab collection because we did a little warm up. We started thinking about why it's important to teach about African-American women in history. If you didn't get a chance to answer that question, we still would really love to hear from you in the chat. But we're also going to go ahead and move forward to our essential question for the day. And this is the question that's going to be guiding our conversation with you. So what we're looking at today is how can museums help you highlight untold stories of African-American women throughout history? So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Tess Porter from the Smithsonian Learning Lab.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tess Porter. I'm an educator at the Smithsonian Learning Lab, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. Today, we're going to be sharing a collection of museum objects that we've pulled together for you on the platform, the Smithsonian Learning Lab. The Smithsonian Learning Lab is a free site where you can discover digital museum resources from across the Smithsonian, adapt and create learning experiences, and share your discoveries and creations with others. We've been actually screen sharing that collection of resources already. We're going to be continuing to work from it today. You can find it yourself by looking in the description of this video, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook. We've got the link there for you to either explore during or after today's session. Now, let's dive into some of the objects that we've gathered here and are going to be exploring together today. You should see 6 different objects here on the screen, and I'd like you to take a moment just to look at these objects, looking for detail, what draws you in. And as you continue to look, we'd all love to hear, what are your first impressions of these objects? What stands out to you? I'm going to copy those questions into the chat so you have them for reference, but please feel free to share your observations and responses to those questions in the chat here. I'll give you a moment to do so. And again, as you look closely and think about what stands out to you, of course, there are no wrong answers. It's what's drawing you in. Perhaps you're seeing some connections between objects, things that make particular objects stand out. I'm seeing some comments starting to come in, noticing different mediums and materials, absolutely. That they're representative perhaps of different periods of time. A particular object is standing out to someone. They're talking about the silhouette figure with neutral tones versus the colorful painting full of people. Someone else is noticing multiple genders, races, ages, and types of professions represented here. And someone else is noticing that too. That's great. Please feel free to keep sharing your impressions in the chat. As you do so, and as you keep thinking about what interests you about these objects, maybe a particular object is standing out to you that you're becoming very curious about, I'm going to turn it back to Allison.
Thanks, Tess. So it's really important that we engage our audience when we're doing lessons like this. And so we want to engage you and ask you where you would like to start our discussion today. So we have our educators ready. We have our 6 educators who are ready to talk about their objects, but we'd like to know from you, where would you like to start? So if you go back to the Mentimeter, which I can see that some of you already know where we're going with this, let us know which object you're most interested in exploring first. So we have A, B, C, D, E, and F. C already has quite a number of votes, but I'm just going to give it another minute, another couple seconds. and we'll see where we're going. But don't worry, we're going to have an opportunity to explore all of the objects. We're just letting you drive a little bit to let us know where you'd like to start. Uh-oh, we have a tie between B and C, so we'll need some tiebreakers in there. Let's wait another minute. We'll see if we can get one. All right, there we go. Wonderful. Okay. All right, I think we probably have most of the votes in. So let's go ahead and start with object C.
All right, that's me. I'm up. I feel like I won the lottery, maybe. My name is Brianna White, and I'm the head of education for the National Portrait Gallery. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this portrait, but I also want you to think about, as I talk about it, how you might look at it closely and the sorts of questions that you might use with your students, whether they be young people or adults. So I would love absolutely for you to put any sorts of comments that you have about the portrait in the chat as we go along. But this portrait is a silhouette of Flora. She was a woman of African heritage enslaved in Milford and Stratford, which were both towns in Connecticut. Now, we know very little about Flora. While much of her story remains a mystery, we draw on available clues to piece together a sense of her life and a better understanding of her portrait. And so to do this, we use a routine that was developed at the Portrait Gallery by one of our curators called description, deduction, and speculation. And this routine really is about understanding the deeper history of material culture. So already to start, right, we are taking a look at a likeness of a person, and that is how the Portrait Gallery defines portraiture. We are a museum that highlights the American story through the individuals who have shaped it. And so when we think about how we look at portraits, we always start with close observation. And in this case, when we're thinking about description, it's close observation about the material evidence provided by the process of silhouette making of this portrait that then supports a visual analysis of the silhouette. So description always leads us into analysis. And then deduction is when we start thinking about we carefully consider the historical evidence of enslavement in New England, women's experiences, and any archival evidence that we may have or we may research concerning Flora. And then we think through speculation. And so speculation is really about informed imagining of the circumstances surrounding Flora's portrait. Now, this portrait is unique for the Portrait Gallery because the truth is that when you think about the mission of the museum, we are about people who are generally in our history textbooks, presidents, etc. But this portrait it's different because it is of somebody that we don't necessarily know from history. And that's really important to the Portrait Gallery, is to highlight untold stories. And I should also mention that we're so fortunate to bring this object into the collection of the Smithsonian jointly. It's owned by both the Portrait Gallery as well as the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So as you continue to think about the way that we look and deduce and speculate about Flora, I'd like you to think about those three ideas as I tell you just a little bit more about her, because we found at the Portrait Gallery that layering in the context or as much context as we have about the image really helps us make meaning and have a better understanding of that image. So I'll just take a couple of moments to talk to you about Flora and then also about the artwork itself. So nothing is known of Flora's early life, but a bill of sale that dates from 1796 notes that she was 19 years old then. So we can deduce that her birth was around 1776, which of course coincided with both the onset of the American War of Independence and the beginnings of anti-slavery activism in Connecticut. And that bill of sale was when Flora was sold from the DeWitt family to a gentleman by the name of Asa Benjamin. And she remained with Benjamin until her death, of which we don't really know when unfortunately that was. This portrait is incredibly rare. A life-size silhouette is rare, but a life-size silhouette of an enslaved woman is extremely rare. This portrait was created with a hollow cut method. The profile was cut out of the light colored paper, and then it was pasted on to the dark colored paper. We don't know that much about the circumstances by which this silhouette was discovered, but what we do know is that it was found in Stratford. It was found in a basement kitchen, and it was found with the 1796 bill of sale. And Tess, if you could, if it's possible to bring up the bill of sale, that would be great. Thank you. So these two objects became conjoined, both physically because they were matted together in one frame when they were found, as well as in people's minds. So scholars assumed a direct relationship, concluding that the silhouette had been made to document Flora as property for the purpose of the sale and to identify her if she tried to escape bondage. But there are other clues that might lead us in a different direction. The silhouette and the bill of sale are made with different materials. They are created with different degrees of skill in different sizes and different folds. And so we begin to wonder, and this is where that speculation comes in, about why was Flora's silhouette really created? And who was it created for? Now, we don't have all of the answers, but the research around this silhouette is ongoing. And I would encourage you to check back with the Portrait Gallery because we are hoping as we continue to do this research that we can uncover more layers and stories to this portrait. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Allison.
Thank you, Brianna. Okay. So now what we'd like to do, instead of asking sort of what piques your interest, what do you see of the objects that are left that are most visually connected to object C, which we just explored? So which object, A, B, D, E, or F, would you like to go to next because it seems visually connected to that silhouette of Flora? So you have a minute for the votes to come in. So we're back on the Mentimeter. If you still have that screen open, you should be able to vote. Otherwise, you can go back to menti.com and put in the code. Okay. All right, so which object feels most visually connected? All right. Okay. We'll give just another few seconds for people to vote. And once you're done voting, leave that Mentimeter screen open because we're going to do this a couple more times just so you're ready next time. All right, I think it looks like we're going to go with A.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name's Kirsten. I'm an educator here at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum here in New York City. And I wanted to talk to you all about this object. So this object is a sampler, and it was made in the year 1803. So we see when we look at it, it has a lot of text. But I wanted to just jump in with some questions. How do you think it was made? Let's look at the materials before we look at the text. So what materials are you noticing when you look at this work? And the reason I ask is, as a design museum, we often work with objects that often serve a purpose. And to uncover that, we can start to unpack the materials and think about their purpose and why they might be used. I'm seeing Eric mentioned needlepoint. Yes, absolutely. So the medium is silk embroidery on a linen foundation, and I'm seeing another person mention embroidery as well. Its technique is embroidered cross stitch. And like I said, as a design museum, we tend to think about objects that have a purpose. So I'd like to dig into sort of like, why do we think this object was made? If we look at it, do you think it serves a purpose? What do you think it may have been for? I notice when I look at this that there's some text that seems to be very carefully stitched, but also that there may have been some mistakes. So someone may have gone over their work a few different times. Another thing I'm noticing is that there's a name on it. So that might make me think something about, its use and what it was for. I'm seeing learning to read. Religious education. Yeah, so we're starting to notice some of the text, it looks like. And to uplift the viewers, I'm noticing in the chat, folks are saying things like that. So yes, this was a sampler, and a sampler is a piece of embroidery or cross-stitching that was produced as kind of like a specimen of achievement to demonstrate someone's needlework. So the function of it was to practice. And we noticed the text, of course, which looks like it was very carefully stitched. And I want to just dive into the text a little bit. And if you hit the I button on the Learning Lab, you'll be able to see the text more clearly and the metadata of the image. So Tess, if you wouldn't mind doing that and scrolling down. So this is the text that we see. And I just want to give folks a minute to look at it and think about what the message might be. I'm noticing that there's some language at the end around banishing slavery's bonds from freedom's plains. So we start to see this image. It's quite a lot of text, but I see in the chat, folks are saying to aid in the abolition of slavery. Yes, this is decidedly a message of abolition or a message of freedom. And now is a great time for me to jump in with some context. So if we want to look at the whole image, that would be great, Tess. We know that this was created in 1803, but there's a little bit more to the story. The sampler was created by Mary Emerson, whose name is kind of signed at the bottom of the sampler, who was a student at the African Free School in New York City. And the African Free School was one of only a small number of institutions that taught African American girls decorative needlework. So a sampler like this is very rare. And the incredible thing is Mary would have had to been between the ages of 4 and 15 to attend the school. So we're looking at work by a young person, likely a teenager or a young adolescent. And we see that Mary ornamented her sampler with this inspirational verse, as you all noticed, calling for an end to slavery and oppression. And in 1803, when this was made in New York City, it was a time of sort of halting progress towards freedom. For context, when she created it, the population of free Black Americans outnumbered enslaved people 3 to 1, but slavery was very much a reality of life in New York City. And New York's gradual emancipation laws were passed in 1799, which granted freedom to enslaved children. And the African Free School, where Mary Emerson attended, was opened just slightly prior in 1794. So this school was one of the first places that needed to come up with practical answers to the questions raised by abolition. Worth mentioning that while that was the goal, the curriculum of the school reflected more of an ambivalent stance on the part of the white founders. So it's worth challenging what the school was about. But I think that this time period tells us a little bit of a story of an atmosphere of confusion, of tension and frustration, but also of hope. And we see this in Mary's message. We're still about 2 generations away from Juneteenth. And, we know working with our own students that the world around them really does impact the way they view themselves and how they show up at school. So if we think about the way students at the African Free School thought about their place in society, like their hopes, their dreams, the sampler is even more fascinating. Not just because of the detail and the craftsmanship, but because it's an incredible primary source. So I'm excited to share that with all of you today, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, so now that we've heard about that, we're going to go back and ask you again, where would you like to go from here? Which of the remaining objects seem most visually connected to the one that we just explored, to object A we just explored? So we have object B, D, E, and F that we can take a look at next. So let us know where you'd like to go. Again, the link to the Mentimeter is in the chat. And you can also use the code up at the top of the screen. We have some votes for E. Some curiosity about F and D. Give it a little bit more time. So object B, D, E, and F are the ones that we haven't looked at yet. So which one feels most visually connected to object A? All right, it looks like we have a lot of curiosity about object E, so let's go there.
Great. All right, let's start. Hi, everyone. My name is Phoebe Sherman, and I'm the Student and Teacher Programs Manager at the National Postal Museum. And you might know the Postal Museum for our vast stamp collections or other materials related to postal operations, but I like to say that at the Postal Museum, we get to talk about American history through a postal lens. And I think that this object really touches on that. And so I first want to start just by taking a couple moments to do some close looking like we've been doing, and you can share in the chat box what you see but just by looking at this object. What might you be able to make some inferences about? What questions might come up for you? And I encourage you to share those now, but also throughout the time that I get to share and talk about this object. So I'll give you all a moment. So I'm sure some things will come up. Thanks, Tess, for zooming in. I'm going to share a little bit about the context of this object, but please feel free to share any observations and questions as I go. So this object is an account book from Blacktown, New Mexico, from the post office there. And you might have noticed the date on the book's cover when Tess zoomed in there for a moment, and it says April 1st, 1913. And that's the date when money orders were first offered in the town of Blacktown. The town of Blacktown was still new in 1913. Its first settlers arrived in 1908. And what's unique about this community is that it was a community that was planned by and for African American homesteaders who had left the South in hopes of gaining land ownership and other rights that were denied to them because of Jim Crow laws. The Blacktown post office itself was established in 1912, and that's really significant to the town's history. The post office, especially in rural areas like Blacktown at this time, it was a source of civic pride. And it also conveyed an additional sense of legitimacy because it's a federal agency that's established in this community. But I really want to talk about the postmasters mostly. So Tess, do you mind going to the next image in the collection? And this is the one that we were all voting on there. So what you're looking at now, this image, it's displaying pages from inside of the account book, and it's indicating the amount of funds that were transferred in forms of money orders as well as deposit receipts. So there's 3 postmasters throughout the history of Blacktown, and the third and final postmaster of Blacktown, New Mexico was a woman, and her name was Bessie E. Malone, and it's her signature and record keeping that you can see on these pages in this image here. She was actually appointed as postmaster on February 23rd, 1916, so that's 107 years ago today. And she served the post office as postmaster until that post office was discontinued in 1919. So it's clear that Blacktown residents had new freedoms and opportunities in a multitude of ways. Town records from Blacktown, New Mexico indicate actually that at least 10 women homesteaded and gained the title to their land. So you can imagine then the sense of responsibility that Postmaster Bessie Malone must have felt. Research on her life and this object is ongoing. This image here was actually taken during treatment in 2022. So I hope I'll get to share more details about her life in the future. But the town of Blacktown itself actually does not exist anymore. Water resources were limited in that area, and when combined with other ecological challenges, residents began to leave. And so by the late 1920s, after the post office was discontinued in 1919, it was a ghost town. But this account book survives, and this account book gives us a peek into the history of the community, and into the history that Bessie was in charge of that record keeping. So in thinking about how you might use this object in your classrooms, a question that I keep coming back to and I invite you to reflect on is, what are the different layers of stories that this object reveals? So you can start with that this reveals a piece of history of Black homestead communities. It reveals the economic history of Blacktown, New Mexico. And in the theme of what we're examining today, it highlights a piece of African American women's history. And it does so through that postal viewpoint. And in a way that I hope would spark investigations in your classrooms into such a complex and especially important stories. And I'm so excited that I get to share this object with you on this day that Bessie Malone became postmaster. So thank you, everyone, and excited to talk about it more.
Thank you, Phoebe. All right, so back to you, our audience. So now we've heard about 3 of our objects. So which one seems most visually connected? Which of the ones that are left seems most visually connected to the postmaster log we just explored? So we have object B, object D, and object F. So again, I'll give you a little bit. The link to the Mentimeter is in the chat again. You can also visit it up at the top. Some curiosity about object B. And while we wait, we do have a question in the chat that's, where is the Postal Museum? Phoebe, I will turn that one back over to you.
Oh, I'm embarrassed to not have said that first. The National Postal Museum is located in Washington, D.C.
All right, just another 1 or 2 seconds, but it looks like we are probably going to object B. Get a little last minute push for object D there. All right, why don't we go ahead and we'll turn to object B.
I always love to see the connections or experience the connections, and I really would love to sit down and say, what is it that connects those different objects for you all visually? But thank you all so much for the opportunity for us to come to you all and share some of the objects from our collections for this webinar here today. I'm the Director of Teaching and Learning in the Education Department at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And we are the National Museum that's devoted to telling the American story through the African American lens. A core value that we hold is to share stories of humanity and all of its nuances, triumphs, and tragedies. Sometimes a well-known figure or event may shed light on the work of and lives of tens or hundreds of lesser-known figures or moments. And conversely, a seemingly unknown moment may open our eyes to a larger movement. And so we're always looking to look at some of those well-known moments that we may have come across in African American history and dive a little deeper and find out what more is there behind that moment. There's many lesser-known stories that we're building up to that well-known moment a lot of times. And with our lesser-known stories, what might it tell us about a larger movement across time that we perhaps had not seen? So this is the object that we're going to focus on today. And I'm just going to pose a couple of questions that we might ask coming to this object. If I was working with a group of teachers in like an in-person workshop, I would ask the question like, what do you see? And please feel free to comment in the chat. I'm going to just kind of go through our questions in the interest of time to share information, but please comment in the chat. What do you see when you're looking at this? I know for some they may say, well, I see a piece of clothing. What else do you see there? If you were to say this is a piece of clothing, I would ask the question, where do you think this piece of clothing would be or could be worn, or where was it worn? Perhaps when was it worn? I look at this piece of clothing, and if I'm coming to it with fresh eyes, it reminds me of clothing that I've seen, perhaps a uniform type of clothing. And so then I would want to ask, well, what's the profession that this piece of clothing may belong to? In the most foundational thinking about this object, we turn to the record, the record that goes along with all objects that are in any collection. And our record says to us that this is, I see a good comment coming through, nursing perhaps. The record tells us that this is a white dress, and it has a front closure of plastic buttons at the top and steel snaps at the bottom. It has a rounded collar and a stitched design on the front with a pleated skirt. The fabric appears to be a cotton polyester blend, and a tag at the neck reads, Sears Fashions, Machine Wash Medium, Sears, Roebuck and Company, USA. There's a lot we could unpack just in that description, but I want to check into the comments for just a second, and then I'll take you on another bit of the journey. So I see that someone says it looks like a tunic for someone working, perhaps serving food. Someone says it looks like a domestic worker uniform or church usher uniform. Yes, these are all good guesses, good thoughts about what this dress or this piece of clothing could be. So I'm going to tell you a little something more about this, what was called in our collection an overdress. And I talk about how it reflects Black women caring for and nurturing one another, the agency of Black women across time, and the resiliency of the Black community in the face of racism. This overdress that we're looking at here belonged to Amanda Carter from Farmville, Virginia, who over the course of her career delivered around 500 babies. A third-generation Black midwife, Mrs. Carter represents a long history of Black women taking care of one another, also holding generational wealth in terms of medical knowledge and birthing the futures of Black communities. In her own words, Mrs. Carter began to share some of her history in a letter where she said, back in the older days of the 1800s, my great-grandma served as a midwife on my mother's side for this community. Their transportation was an ox cart. In that same letter, she goes on to talk about how her grandmother then took over midwifing, being apprenticed under her great-grandmother, and then her mother became licensed and trained many midwives, and then her mother also trained her as a midwife. Midwifery is as old as culture. When we think about midwifery as a practice, it's as old as culture. The term refers to a person, most often a woman, who is with women, caring for them. The term and role of midwife is most familiar to us as thinking of a woman who helps an expectant mother through pregnancy, the birthing process, and then as needed afterwards. In the days of enslavement, African American midwives were integral. Their role was multi-layered, and they held precious traditional and healing knowledge and customs. According to researcher and author Jenny Luke, midwives were mothers, both literally and symbolically. They were physically mothers of their own children and symbolic mothers of all the children they delivered. They were also mothers of the community because they taught the skills of mothering, and they were mothers of a culture that was preserved and protected throughout the generations of midwives. Midwifery as a career and community role became endangered in the 19th century as the male-centered, empirical, science-based medicine was considered the better standard. Even beyond the era of enslavement, racism prevented African American women from accessing that mainstream medical care, and African American midwives continued to be central to the Black community even through the 1940s. As midwifery professional licensing demands were presenting challenges for more women to join the profession, Mrs. Carter was highlighted as one of 118 licensed midwives in Virginia in 1972. So when I look at this overdress as an object, it allows us to go back in time and really begin to talk about and understand more about the intersection of motherhood, healthcare, racism, and control of one's body and control of one's labor. This overdress also allows us to carry the conversation forward into our own time. In a 2002 statement from the Center for Disease Control, Black women are 3 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause than white women. Multiple factors contribute to these disparities, such as variations in quality healthcare, underlying chronic conditions, structural racism, and implicit bias. Midwifery is on the rise again in the US as more people are understanding the benefits which can arise from the holistic approach that many midwives take. Additionally, there's a movement to increase the number of Black midwives working in the field to reclaim the heritage of the intrepid ancestors who stood in the breach when mainstream medical help was not accessible or denied. These modern-day midwives are fearless in their missions to combat structural racism while improving Black birthing outcomes. So in summary, when I see this overdress, and as an educator, when I think about what this overdress can represent for us, it's Black women being in community with one another. It's that long-term knowledge about mothering, about healthcare, traditions, customs that are being shared across generations. It's making a way out of no way and feeling that African American empowerment, community empowerment. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Kendra. All right, well, I think by now you probably suspect what's happening next. So we have 2 objects left that we would like to explore. We have object D and object F. So we will definitely get to both of them, but we are curious to know which of those 2 objects, D and F, do you find most visually connected to object B, to the midwife overdress? So again, we're in the Mentimeter. The link is in the chat, and you can use the code at the top of the screen. And let us know which ones you find more visually connected. At the moment, it looks like object F, but we'll wait. Oh. Object D pulling ahead. I'm giving you another couple of seconds. See if we can get some tiebreaker votes in there. Otherwise, we may just have to do a coin toss or something. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Thank you. All right, let's see. 1 or 2 more seconds. See if we get a couple of other votes in there. Looks like we're leaning towards object D. All right, thank you. All right, so we'll look at object D, and then after that, we're going to look at object F.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Phoebe Hilleman, and I'm the Teacher Institute's educator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, or SAM, as we call it. I'm really excited that the piece that I chose for this webinar is next, because I actually see a lot of connection between the midwifery uniform that Kendra just showed and the stories in this painting. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. Just to give you a little brief background on SAM, our collection includes over 46,000 artworks in a range of media, stretching across 3 centuries. And our collection really explores the American experience through lenses such as history, culture, identity, place, and creative expression. And when we look at our artworks with students, or when we teach with them, we usually use an inquiry-based approach that starts with close looking. So, as you're looking at this painting, I encourage you to share in the chat what you notice and what it makes you wonder. I'm going to sort of talk through my notices, what I notice and what my wonderings are. I'm immediately drawn in by the bright green background and the other bold colors in this painting. I noticed the purples, the yellows, green, of course, and the red. And I notice 8 figures, which appear to me to be women. They seem to have a range of skin tones, and they're surrounded by these sort of miniaturized buildings. So that makes me wonder, who these people are, how they might be connected to one another, and also how they might be connected to these buildings that we see. And, while we always start with close looking and inquiry, I think this is a painting that does really benefit from some background knowledge. Unfortunately, we have a lot of that for this artwork. This painting is titled Women Builders, and it was created by the African-American artist William H. Johnson in 1945, and it's part of a series he created at the time called Fighters for Freedom. And that series, which is his final body of work, he considered it the culmination of his career at that point. And it pays tribute to the lives and accomplishments of historical figures and also Johnson's contemporaries at the time, who engaged in struggles for emancipation, civil rights, and even world peace, stretching from the time of the American Revolution up through World War II. The series includes well-known figures such as Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but this is an example of one of his works that really highlights names that might be less familiar to most people. And just to let you all know, Sam has organized an exhibition about the Fighters for Freedom series that's currently touring around the country and will open at our museum in Washington, D.C. in March of 2024. But this painting, Women Builders, takes its name and inspiration from a 1931 book by Sadie Iola Daniel. And it was a collection of biographies of successful Black women in the 19th and 20th centuries who founded influential schools, social organizations, and financial organizations serving African Americans. These women really created opportunities for African Americans at a time when Jim Crow laws were enforcing racial segregation and disenfranchisement for Black people, particularly in the American South. And Sadie Iola Daniel's Women Builders book is actually available in full online for free through the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center. So you can see the illustrations and the photographs that Johnson used as visual reference for this painting. Just to tell you briefly who some of these women are in the painting. Starting in the top left, we have Lucy Craft Laney, who in the late 19th century founded the Haynes Normal and Industrial Institute in Georgia. It was the first school in the state to offer kindergarten to African-American children and served students all the way up through junior college programs in tracks such as nursing and teaching. To her right, we have Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who founded the Palmer Memorial Institute, which is a prestigious day and boarding school for African Americans in rural North Carolina. To her right, we have Maggie Lena Walker, who was the first Black woman to charter a bank and become its president in the United States. The St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, which was in Richmond, Virginia, served the Black community there for decades. And by 1920, it had issued more than 600 mortgages to Black families, allowing them to become homeowners. Beneath Maggie Lena Walker, we have Jane Edna Hunter, who's in the blue there in the middle. She's a social worker who founded the Phyllis Wheatley Association to provide young Black women with safe housing, job training, and recreation in Cleveland. In the bottom right, we have Nannie Helen Burroughs, who's a local DC connection. She founded the National Training School for Women and Girls here in DC with money raised from small donations from African Americans in the community, many of whom were Black women. The figure in the lower left, wearing the yellow shirt with the blue jacket over it, is Janie Porter Barrett, who founded the Locust Street Social Settlement, which was the United States' first settlement house for African Americans. And she later founded a school for Black girls who were considered delinquent or dependent in Hanover County, Virginia, sort of as a way to rehabilitate them. And then finally, in the bottom left, we have Mary McLeod Bethune, who founded an influential school serving African Americans in Florida that evolved into what today is Bethune-Cookman College. And she became a nationally recognized education leader, civil rights advocate, and became the only female member of President Franklin Roosevelt's informal Black cabinet. You may have noticed one woman we didn't mention, and sort of in the middle. She does not appear in the book on the right there. Yes, thanks, Tess. And our curator thinks it's possible this may represent the author of the book herself. But really, each woman in this painting has such a fascinating story, persistence, community-based work, and success in the face of pretty steep odds. And we can think of the title Women Builders as referring not only to the building of these physical places, but also sort of the building of institutions, systems of knowledge, and economic opportunities for the next generation. So I think this could be a really interesting jumping off point for students for research and a way to explore these really important stories that often get overlooked. So thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe. All right, so I think that leaves us with Object F, the tennis racket. Orlando?
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here on a Thursday afternoon with us. My name is Orlando Serrano, and I am the manager for Youth and Teacher Programs at the National Museum of American History. Now, I'm going to go last, and I'm going to be both brief and as concise as possible because I'm not going to be short on this story that is important to share. And it's always funny how these play out. I had no idea what the flow was going to be. None of us do, and whether it would relate or make any sense, and it kind of does. So building off of the work that Phoebe just shared, that really centered the role of Black women and advocacy and awareness. This is a tennis racket that you all can see before you. And it is Naomi Osaka's tennis racket. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the racket and Naomi and how it's connected to the work that we're doing at NMAH. So Naomi was born in Japan to a Japanese mother and a Haitian father. However, when she was 3, the family moved to New York, where Naomi grew up and learned how to play tennis and has lived here ever since. Um, and that's an important sort of background for you all to know, which I hope will become evident as we sort of unfold or unspool the story of Naomi and why I chose the racket and how it represents the work that NMAH is doing to think about US history through the 1.8 million objects and artifacts that we have in our collections. All that to say is she is very much part of a global Black diaspora, but was racialized as Black in the United States. And that's very important to think about and consider, and really gets at the heart of some of the work that we're doing at NMH right now. This racket that you see before you is the one that she used at the US Open in 2020. This is important for a couple of reasons. So right before this particular tournament, Jacob Blake was killed at the hands of police in Wisconsin. And that was in August as a lead up to the US Open. And she decided as an act of protest to not participate in the tournament and sit down and not play. And the WTA, the Women's Tennis Association, postponed all the matches on that day. And then at the US Open, Osaka, who has been characterized as shy leading up to this particular tournament, used the opportunity at every press conference to wear a mask with the name of another Black person who had been killed at the hands of police to raise awareness of police brutality in the United States. Some of the folks who she put on her mask, because this was during COVID, the height of COVID, right, were Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Elijah McClain, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and Philando Castile. 3 of those individuals were killed that year and that summer leading up to that tournament. At the end of that year, she was also nominated or called or heralded together with a group of other athletes as Sports People of the Year for her advocacy work and her activism. In the years since, she has also really taken a stance on the importance of mental health, famously walking away from the tournament to take care of herself due to the pressure that she received at press conferences to represent Blackness, quite frankly, at a global scale. She decided to walk away. Now, again, how is this related to NMAH and how we're thinking about US history? I chose this racket because it is indicative of what we're doing and thinking about the US both at the local and global context. And this is why I brought up the fact that, yes, she is very much a member of a global Black diasporic community, but she was also racialized as Black in the United States, and that matters to her as evidenced by the activism that she's been a part of. It also forces us to think about the limits and opportunities for understanding African American experience as part of Blackness at a global scale, which is really a way to force us to also think about how the United States history in an ever interconnected and entangled global environment in which we live, how is US history also imbricated and connected to world history? And lastly, the point I want to bring up is that we are also thinking about history a little bit differently, right? Like oftentimes when people think about history, they think about the past or things that are over. But really, the study of history is a study of change over time. And right now, there's a lot of change that's occurring in front of us. And so we are really taking into account how we can be observers, folks who are studying the history that is unfolding and that we are making in live time. And Naomi and her efforts to call us out and to think about the US in a global context is very important to that work that we're doing. So if I was thinking about how to use this in my classroom, I would ask the question, and the driving question would be, how can we contextualize US history at the global scale? That is my time. Thank you all for being here.
Orlando, thank you. Well, as we're hitting the 5 o'clock hour, we'd like to bring it all together before giving Allison a little bit of time to introduce you to our series of edX courses. So if you all remember, our guiding question for the evening was, how can museums help you highlight untold stories of African American women throughout history? So continue thinking about that. But I think that given the amazing stories, the untold stories that we have all highlighted over the past hour, I think a lot of that goes without saying. So what I'd like to do is ask my colleagues sort of this closure question, which is, how do these objects really begin to extend our understanding of the contributions of African American women throughout history? I know I learned a lot over the past hour. So I'd love to hear from my colleagues about what they're thinking as well.
I can jump in. I'm really struck by just the range of types of objects we have here, and thinking about, where we look for knowledge about these stories that are often left out of history books and textbooks. So going to such a wide variety of types of sources and firsthand objects is really striking to me.
Yeah, and the fact, Phoebe, right, that these objects really take us across time, right? Other thoughts, colleagues?
I think something that really stands out for me is looking at many of these objects and listening to your stories about them. It's thinking about how Black women are representing themselves, how they want to represent themselves externally, and that conversation, and then what happens, or the struggles that happen when there is an identity imposed upon Black women, and how the different responses come about, right? Throughout our different objects, how the responses come about, where the responses have been via history, and just the power that we see when a Black woman is allowed and given the space to define herself. And that's amazing to see that through our objects.
Yeah. Thank you, Kendra.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll build off of what you just said, Kendra. Because, so one of the things that struck me is the sort of, we started and ended in what I can only think about as a global context, right? So like enslavement occurred through the transatlantic slave trade, and Naomi is pushing us to think about Blackness at that scale, quite frankly. And I'm thinking, one of the statements that she made as Naomi received a lot of criticism when she decided to represent Japan during the Olympics. There was a lot of backlash, and folks were saying, well, maybe you're not Black. And she was very vocal and said, like, African American is not the only kind of Black. And I appreciate, again, like, what happens when folks can assume an identity versus be ascribed an identity, which I appreciate. Oh, also, I wanted to share a haiku that that we wrote behind the scenes because we were running out of time. So I was like, maybe I just have to have a haiku for Naomi Osaka. So Kendra wrote, "Mighty tennis star, defying stereotypes," and I had to edit just a little bit. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, Orlando. So with that, thank you all. I'm going to turn it over to Allison to share a little bit about our edX courses that we've been working on over these past few years.
Yeah, thanks, Brianna. So this pop-up is actually part of a series of edX courses that we've created over the last 3 years that are about how to use museum objects in your classroom. So these were summer sessions that started in 2020 when we all shut down for COVID. And then it was when we did the first series, we had another Summer Institute online in 2021, and then a third one in 2022. And we are a member of the edX platform under Smithsonian X. And so we were able to take these courses that we ran and bundle them together as a package. So if you're interested in professional development opportunities from the Smithsonian, this is an opportunity that you can do online from home. And there are a couple different ways that you can participate. So if you're interested, you can take the entire package, which consists of all 3 courses in the program. And that's something where there's, for the full experience, there's a price for that. And then you get a professional certificate at the end that you can then submit to your district for credit. If you also just want to audit the courses, you're welcome to do that as well. And you can come to I think we're going to drop this link in the chat. And you can come to any of the courses and then click view the course. And they're all, 1 to 2 hours a week. We've extended them for 14 weeks, but it probably will take you a little bit less than that if you're interested. View the course, and then you can click enroll. And when you enroll, you have the choice of auditing the course or paying for it. And once you get into the course, you'll see that they were broken down, and it's really similar to the experience that you had today. So what we did today in this pop-up is we mimicked the opening session for you, where everyone came and talked about the different objects that they found in their collections that worked for a particular theme we were covering. And then we got a sense of each individual museum has their own session where you can learn more about objects in their museum. And then we did a couple of paired sessions where we had 2 museums working together that maybe you wouldn't necessarily consider that there would be overlap, but teaching in an interdisciplinary way is really important to us here at the Smithsonian. We believe in doing everything in an interdisciplinary way, and so we wanted to really demonstrate that for you for your classroom. So this is an example of just what you might see. You'll see that there's a session, there's a reflection question, and then there's a check you can do. So we hope that we will that these are opportunities that are available to you and accessible to you in your private time. And we wanted to wrap up by just thanking you for joining us today. We know you have very busy and long days as educators, and we appreciate you taking this hour plus to be with us and learning more about using museum objects in your classroom. We very much hope to see you again in one of our upcoming in-person summer teacher institutes or in one of the online summer sessions on edX.